Trucks there built to serve. Last week, Cowboys safety Malik Hooker criticized Micah Parsons' dedication to his podcast. Take a listen.
My advice would be for Micah would be, just make sure we're all right, where and being where your feet are. Because if we're at work and, the run game's terrible, but you're doing a podcast every week and the run game is terrible, then, what are you really caring about? Are you caring about the crowd that, is watching your podcast? Are you caring about the success of our team and the Super Bowl that we're trying to reach?
Okay, that was from Keyshawn Johnson's podcast. Now, Micah tweeted this and then deleted it. Just wish you said this to me, but instead on some podcast. And you've got my number. And you're my locker mate. So you could have said this any day. You do realize I shoot the podcast on our off day, ! Why aren't we talking about everyone's preparations and focus leading up to the game week? I mean, I can point out a lot of things, but I'm just not. Then he deleted it. Bro, your reaction to this podcast mess.
I told you, my thoughts on the podcast well documented. I don't think Micah should have been doing it from the get-go.
True.
Because he's young and hasn't won yet. And if you look at most of the guys, the Kelsey brothers, they've won. They're veterans. Draymond Green, won, veteran. Paul George at least is a veteran, all right, even though he hasn't won. Well, Pat Bev's a veteran. Okay. I mean, I'm just saying, like, a guy that knows the,
Michael
the way
Porter
things
Jr.,
work.
I guess he's won. Damn, you're right.
If you win or you're a veteran, fine. But Micah, and it's not even his fault. He's just young. All right? Yes. So I don't think he should have been doing the podcast from day one. That said, Micah's right. Like, Malik Hooker, did he forget he was? I think he forgot he was on the podcast.
I don't think he did.
He thought he and Keyshawn were just chilling.
I don't think that's
talking. I mean, Micah is absolutely right. Why didn't you just come to me and say, man, look, I don't think it's a good idea. Because I think Malik's talking for the team, too.
Maybe he is.
I don't think he's just talking for, Micah says he didn't go to him. So here's the problem. If Micah drops the podcast now.
Well, he can't. He just got promoted.
I know. He's the president now. So now is he going to be editing other podcasts or what? I mean, come on.
He's got people that rely on it.
And if he did drop it, it looks like he's kowtowing to Malik Hooker now. The best thing for them to do is for Malik to go on the Micah's podcast.
Oh, my God.
And no, seriously. And they settle it. And then if Micah decides, you know what? I am gonna drop it because this year, man, we are.
Oh, and then this is like a final.
Then it'll look better, then you're not just kowtowing to Malik Hooker.
Let's do one more podcast and then shut it down.
Wouldn't that be a huge podcast?
I don't know.
That'd be a huge podcast.
All right, so here's the problem, because I think so much of this is silly nonsense. I don't even think what Malik Hooker there was saying made a lot of sense, to be honest. He's like, if our run game's terrible, are you worried about that, or are you worried about your podcast audience?
So I think but sometimes Micah airs out problems with his own team.
So maybe
you're saying rather than she shouldn't say,
I don't know, but we've seen issues.
But here's the point I'm making. And as you guys know, I often like to quote various scenes from The Wire.
Yes.
Slim Charles at one point says to Avon Barksdale, it don't matter if it's a lie. If it's a lie, we have to fight on the lie. And what he's saying is, what is true is no longer relevant. What is relevant is what people believe and the perception, and that is the reality with which we must live. Even if I think it's nonsense that Micah's podcast is actually causing any real harm, there's now the placebo effect almost that it's perceived to. And now it's a problem.
Yeah.
Because now it actually has caused problem because in this meta world of criticism of the podcast on a different podcast has caused a problem within that locker room. It just has.
Yeah.
To where he's responding to a teammate, deleting the tweet, and now at training camp, it's got to be addressed.
Got to be on a podcast.
So I think that Micah is right now probably pretty typical for how our 20-something-year-old super famous, star athletes would always have acted, talked, sounded like, you know what I mean? Good intentions, but don't know what they don't know. But he is just out there in the public space so often. There's a lot of opportunities for him to piss off teammates or other people, and it seems, unfortunately, like that's what's happened here.
Okay, so I think there's a lot going on here, actually. And I think they all brought up some good points. But I think they left out a few that I really want to highlight. I think really what's really happening at the core of it is that players take issue with Micah Parsons, both because of his personality and his success, how good he is, and the fact that he's going to be getting paid all this money, and that he has a podcast, because there's other players that are really great in that locker room, but they don't have the charisma. They're not going to get that paid amount of money. They're not as famous. Maybe they're not as young as him. So I think there is some jealousy at play, but also some of the issues that they have with Micah is also well-founded. As in, like, he does talk too much. He does, try to put blame elsewhere. Like, he called out the entire franchise, essentially, multiple times. And again, it's annoying. When your best player kind of has that attitude, it's harder for even the players that know, yeah, you are really good, and yes, you are technically better than all of us. We don't like you now. And we don't like you now because of some of the petty reasons, which just kind of happens, but also for justifiable reasons. And when the petty reasons and the justifiable reasons combine together, it just explodes. And to me, that's exactly what you get in that podcast with Malik. Like, that's exactly what you see, where he's kind of saying all this kind of stuff because he kind of takes issues with how Micah's handling his business. And it's just kind of like, okay, because, the way how he hears that, like Malik or anyone else, when Micah says this team's not good enough, he's like, so what are you saying? Are you saying that I'm not good enough? Like, you're the one wasting your time on a podcast, bro. Like, we're the ones that are, working, doing this, that. And it just kind of becomes like a snowball effect. And I think it is a mistake to be doing the podcast. But I also understand why he's doing the podcast, right? Everybody wants a podcast. I want a podcast. You want a podcast, right? We all want to share our opinions, and I get it. But here's the thing that's interesting, and my friend always points this out, and I think he's largely right. He talks about various doctors. Now, for those of you who have not had a lot of interactions with a lot of doctors, and you're lucky, but for someone like me who's had a lot of injuries and other various health things, whether with myself or family, you can see that a lot of doctors sometimes are very dedicated to just the practice of medicine. And I promise this is what's going to make sense. You have a lot of surgeons, whatever, who are very focused on doing surgeries. That is their priority. That is their goal. Then you have these other doctors that they're in charge of this board and that board, and they teach, and they're like, the director of this program and the director of that program. And on the surface, it's like, look how accomplished this doctor is. He's the director of orthopedic surgery at so-and-so. But the reality is that when you do those things, you are actually practicing medicine less. You are now doing more business. You are now actually building more prestige for the reason, like I just said, where I'm like, oh my God, look what this guy has done. It becomes more political, more business, and less hands-on medicine. And my friend who's, well-versed and a healthcare worker, he talks about how, like, being a doctor is not good enough for those doctors. They needed more. They needed more prestige. They needed more power. They needed more, like, resume candy and awards and credentials and all of that. That them just being a surgeon wasn't enough. And so typically those guys are usually not as good as doctors. They're not as good as surgeons. Not always, of course. Not always. But it's a thing. And it makes a lot of sense. When you see now these days, especially with YouTube and other social media platforms, you see plenty of doctors and lawyers and whatever, like more iconic, professions. They all have like YouTube pages now and social media. And it's like, I trust those professionals less because they're not interested in practicing real medicine, real law, whatever the profession may be. Like, they want a social media following. They want more money or whatever it may be. And so that is kind of the vibes that Micah can get, where it's like he's more interested in, and that's what kind of Hooker was all saying, like, in more of the fame, in more of the flashy stuff, not the nitty gritty of on the field, let's win. He's more interested in the clicks and the views and sharing his opinion and starting another revenue stream and, just building that other aspect of his life. And if you're all about the business, you're all about football, yeah, when you see someone like Micah doing all those things, like you're going to it's going to be frustrating. And it's also going to be frustrating, especially if he's also equally a really good player, because you're going to be like, he's getting away with this because he is good. And again, that's where then like the pettiness and the justifiable reasons kind of just can really clash with one another. And I think that's largely what's happening with Micah, especially if Micah maybe was a better leader. And last season he said, at the end of last season, he says, I need to play better. This was on me. Next season, we are going for it. I can't wait. But instead, his first words were, Jerry Jones better get us a better team. Clearly we're not good enough and we need a better team, which is calling out your team. It's saying that those other guys are not good enough. It's not taking responsibility. And so if you're looking at that, you're like, man, screw you. But at the same time, Hooker is also like in the wrong for saying all that stuff publicly like that. Like it's that's what I'm saying. Like it's all ugly no matter how you want to slice it. Like it's really just not good. No matter how you want to look at it, it's not positive because, if I'm Micah, even if I'm doing all this type of stuff, I'm still also mad that I can't believe he said that because, like, sure, maybe I called out that saying that our team wasn't good enough, but I didn't call out individuals. You're calling out an individual. That's a whole nother level up. So it's tough. And in terms of also one more comment about specifically the podcast itself, because I know a lot of people are going to be like, he's allowed to do the podcast, blah, 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 blah. Yes and no. Because listen, I don't think a podcast is as like the actual recording itself is not as distracting, but I guarantee you he's lost in the popularity. How many more followers or subscribers or views is he getting? The revenue growing, like he's seeing that grow. It's very addicting, and I can only imagine that is a distraction. There's just no way it's not. And we know that with other professions, that you're not allowed to have another job. If you get hired for Apple or Google or wherever, you're not allowed to like also work another job or another part-time job or this or that. Like you have to just do this one job. They don't let you do these other things because they want all of your attention to be there. That's why you get paid all the money that you get paid. So a lot of fans always want to act like these professional athletes just deserve to have all the freedom. They should be able to be allowed to do every single thing they want to do in the entire universe. And that's not the way it works. You get paid hundreds of millions of dollars and get to play in the NFL. Some sacrifices have to be made, which means maybe you have to live in a terrible city or a city that you've never wanted to live in. Maybe you're going to get paid $150 million, but guess what? At any moment, you can be traded to a losing team. And it's not boo-hoo. That's just part of it. Because most people aren't getting paid all that money in the world, and yet they still have to maybe get transferred over to a completely different city and uproot their lives. So again, these athletes don't deserve any sympathy in that regard. They just don't. Considering especially how much money and fortune is brought their way. So this idea that Micah should be allowed to kind of do whatever he wants. He should be able to have the podcast. He should be able to do this. He should be able to do that. And make money and play football. I just reject that. And I hear a lot of people saying that anytime you criticize any kind of player, that section of the fan base always comes out and says, they just like unconditionally support these athletes like they're somehow a victim. And it's like these guys, Micah Parsons is not a victim. There is nothing about Micah being a victim here. But if you want to just say, listen, what do I care about? Do I care about winning? Do I want my players to care about winning? Like, yes. And it's just, it is tough because if Micah was a better leader and had a better reputation, then doing the podcast, I don't think you necessarily have to be a seasoned veteran or you have to be a winner in order to have a podcast. Like, that's a silly rule. That's like, I get that can be like an easy path into it, right? Like an easy, way to open up that door. But I think it's also just your reputation and who you are. And if you're known to give it your all, you do everything you can on the field. No one questions your preparation. No one questions your dedication. And you do everything you can. And you're a great leader and everyone likes you within the locker room and you say all the right things. Then I think you can have a podcast. I think some other people will still take an issue with it, like the old school people who say, who are you to talk? You haven't won. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it would be actually detrimental, right? Like this whole idea that you have to be 100% focused nonstop is wrong. Famously, the Golden State Warriors, Andre Iguodala and Steph Curry went golfing in the middle of the NBA Finals because they were down in the series. They were just not, where they wanted to be, and they went golfing, okay? And it's kind of crazy because if they did that and it was like a 2-2 series or whatever, people probably would have ripped them and been like, well, and if they ended up losing that series, they would have ripped them and said, you're too distracting. Why should Steph Curry be golfing during the NBA Finals? That's ridiculous. No superstar would ever do that. But they won. And so now it's kind of like either just swept under the rug or highlighted in the way that I'm highlighting it as like, isn't that crazy? Isn't that great? So it's just we judge the outcomes. We pick and choose how we want to judge something, whether it's favorably or unfavorably. But the thing that can't be denied is that when you are someone like Micah, who has become legitimately controversial at this point within the Cowboys organization in terms of the staff, the players, the fans, people either love him or hate him, and of course now the outside fans who aren't necessarily Cowboys fans, and they all have their opinions about Micah. So he's become a controversial figure. When you are a controversial figure and you now do have a thing like a podcast and you're not winning and you're not performing the best in the playoffs, well, of course, no one's going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and they are going to come at you. It's just the way it works, and it's just the way it's always been, and it's just the way it's always will be. But those are just my thoughts. I would absolutely love to hear yours. What do you guys all think? Do you think the podcast is actually a problem for Micah? Do you think it's contributing to any of the hostility, whether from the fans, the front office, the coaching staff, the other players? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single comment, so whether you agree with me or disagree with me, either way, let's get in some discussions, let's get in some fights, but ultimately, let's just have some fun. And please do consider subscribing. We are building an amazing community here, and I would absolutely love to see you part of it. I want to build something that we all genuinely feel connected to, something that we're really excited to be part of. I think we're well on our way to doing it. And please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, as it really does help with the visibility and the algorithm. Thank you so much, and see you next time.